Hi there, Higher Politics. How are we doing? Today I'm going to talk to you about power, authority and legitimacy from the political theory section. And this section is a very, very interesting section, but it is something that is quite demanding in terms of the amount that you have to write and exemplify when it comes to essay writing. So, the three big areas: power, authority, legitimacy. I'll talk through each of them and talk about the key theorists as we go through, because the key theorists are absolutely fundamental to you being able to articulate an appropriate argument as we go through this. So, first of all, I'm going to start with power, and when we look at power, the main theorist that we focus on is a guy called Stephen Lukes. Now, Stephen Lukes thinks there are three faces of power. So, 1, 2, 3. Not Trump, May and Corbyn, but you've got the first face, which is the open face of power. Second face, which is agenda setting. And the third face, which is manipulation. So very, very briefly, just to start out with, the first face of power is this idea that if you have a conflict within society, so for example, in Parliament, if you've got an issue, something that is being debated, such as, for example, the smoking ban in the Scottish Parliament a number of years ago, there was those who supported it because it was seen as a positive move for healthcare in the country, and there were those who felt that actually it would harm businesses and its actual health impact may be quite limited. So there is your conflict, whether we should introduce a smoking ban or not. The same would apply to same-sex marriage. The same would apply to pretty much any decision. So you've got an observable conflict. Something that you can clearly see is a conflict between two sides. And the one way to tell who exercises the power in that situation is the side which prevails, which wins. So, for example, in that case, when the smoking ban was passed by the Scottish Parliament, it was clear to see that the supporters of that bill exercised the power because they prevailed, they won the vote. So it's transparent, you can clearly see the power being exercised, it's open, and there is no doubt who exercises the power in that regard. I often say a perfect example, you know, if you're in a household and you can't decide which takeaway to have at the weekend, if you're not eating healthy for one weekend, and you're looking at Chinese or Indian, and you decide to go for one or the other, whoever prevails exercises the power in that situation. It's very simple, very, very easy to access. But when you're exemplifying that in an essay, folks, try to bring in some form of legislation from recent years, or even in the not too distant past, to demonstrate which side prevailed with Stephen Lukes' open face of power. Okay. The second face is agenda setting. So it's not quite as transparent as the open face, but basically this means that if you are shaping decisions, you are framing the debate. So you're basically saying, this is on the political agenda, but we're keeping this off of it. It means that you frame the scope of the debate. So it means you're able to say what is spoken about and what isn't spoken about. So for example, in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, in the run-up to that vote, when they were trying to decide the question, the decision to have a binary choice between yes and no meant that the option of Devo Max, you know, basically, you know, a full version of devolution, was kept off the table. That third option was not given to the public in a vote. The same was the case in the 1979 devolution referendum, that, you know, independence was kept off the agenda. So you're framing the scope of the debate. And who exercises that power? It can be people in politics who are in power, absolutely can be. It could be those who are in the shadows. So, for example, In your PowerPoints, in your booklets, you'll come across political advisors like Dominic Cummings, for example, Steve Bannon, who advised Donald Trump and helped frame the debate there. You can actually go further with agenda setting as well. You can look at how certain politicians look to frame a debate. So, for example, Democrats in the United States will frame an issue on abortion as a healthcare issue, whereas Republicans tend to do it as defending the life of the unborn child. So there are various levels of that. I think primarily, though, what you want to look at is about how certain things are kept off the agenda. If I go back very, very simply to the kind of takeaway example, Indian and Chinese were the options. Pizza was kept off the agenda. It wasn't brought in to the agenda at all, so it wasn't part of the decision making. So the person who framed that debate exercises power not on a completely open level, but sets up the terms of that debate, sets up the terms of that conflict quite markedly. The third one, manipulation. Now, Stephen Lukes calls this the most insidious face of power because it's the hardest one to actually identify. It's not transparent. People work in the shadows, and those who have the power exercised over them maybe don't realise they have been manipulated. So, for example, one of the big accusations against the Leave campaign in the 2016 EU referendum was that they manipulated voters into voting Leave when originally many of them were likely to vote Remain because of the red bus. And just by chance, I'm wearing this t-shirt that shows the red bus there, folks. This idea that, you know, £350 million per week would go to the National Health Service if people voted Leave. That has been seen to be not completely accurate since. And the accusation against the Leave campaign is that this was knowingly put out there to voters to try and alter their viewpoint on that. You know, this moves someone. I mean, someone starts out with a desire for having one particular option. They change that desire over time, and the process in the middle is manipulation. Something has been fed into their minds that makes them alter. A feminist, for example, would argue that, you know, when women decide that they want to look after their family more regularly than going into the workplace or seek promotions, that's because manipulation through advertising or whatever has been put out there to make them convinced that actually they don't want this promotion, they don't want this job opportunity, it's better to stay at home and look after the kids. You know, it's the same with media. I mean, I've used the example in class. During lockdown, I suppose we're using the PlayStation 4 more, but I bought a PlayStation 4 on Black Friday a couple of years ago. Now, I walked into Tesco that day without any intention of buying a PlayStation 4. Zero intention. But the low price and the deal that was put out there by the advertisers changed my desire. I had been manipulated into buy it. I've played it hardly at all since I've got it, although lockdown's probably changed that quite a bit. But manipulation can work on a range of levels. You'll notice near Christmas time the amount of adverts that come on TV. Children who didn't want that toy at all suddenly see it and their mind is changed. In political terms, there's various examples. Tony Blair was accused of misleading Parliament in 2003 about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. The 45-minute claim that Saddam could launch a nuclear weapon or a chemical weapon within 45 minutes convinced a number of MPs in Parliament to back the war against Iraq when initially they had no intention of doing so. So manipulation is seen as very insidious, folks, and it can be very effective, but it's very, very hard to track. Very hard to track. So try to make sure you bring in some of those examples. Try and illustrate with your own examples where you possibly can, and try and explain how it's relevant. We can clearly see that each of these three types of power are still relevant to a large extent within the modern day. And manipulation in particular, when you see that the various different methods of media outlets, you have various different methods that politicians use to connect with voters. So you could argue that manipulation is perhaps on the increase. The open face of power is dead obvious anyway, and agenda setting has always been an issue anyway. So try to think about how you best analyse that yourself. We then move to authority. Now, authority is those who have who have the power. So, for example, what is the distinction between the two of them? I mean, if you think about power, if I'm someone who exercises power over someone, it doesn't mean to say I've got a particular position, like a job, that allows me to do that. Authority implies that they maybe have the right to do that. Now, whether that be part of an office, part of a job, or whether that be something that people carry in terms of their personality or whatever, we'll investigate. So the main theorist for this one is Max Weber. And he looks at three types. He looks at traditional authority, charismatic, and legal rational, or rational legal. So the first one is traditional authority. And basically this means that someone carries authority among a range of followers because it has always been that way, or it has been long established that that is the case. One of the prime examples of this is the Pope within the Catholic Church. Now, the Pope, the current Pope is something like 250 odd Pope that has been in the Catholic Church. But Pope Francis has the same authority among Catholics as every other Pope, all the way back to who the Catholic Church said was the first one, was St. Peter. Because that has been a long established tradition, regardless of the individual who holds that office, that person will carry authority by virtue of that tradition. So individual Catholics may have their own preferred Pope, but at the same time, among Catholics, they will respect each Pope's right to govern the Church because they hold that role. They hold the seat of the Pope. The same would apply to the monarchy. You know, Queen Elizabeth obviously gains a lot of respect because of who she is as a person. But when Prince Charles takes over and then Prince William takes over, they will have the same traditional authority as she had, simply by virtue of being on the throne. A kind of modern day example that's slightly more modern, but it feels as though this has always been the case, is North Korea, the Kim dynasty. So Kim Jong-un, the current leader, is a different person, obviously, from his father, Kim Jong-il, and his grandfather, Kim Il-sung. But they all have the exact same right to have that authority because they are the leader of North Korea. They are the chairman of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And that authority stands because it's traditional. Then we move on to charismatic authority. So, for example, if someone has got charisma, they have got an X factor, something that makes them stand out, something that makes them really stand out from the crowd, something that makes them completely different, and they're not easily replaceable. So, for example, when you looked at someone like Barack Obama, who was US president from 2009, Barack Obama had a certain something about him, a magnetism. He was cool, he was young, he was energetic, he was like a once-in-a-generation politician. In fact, he was so charismatic that the amount of donations that he was getting on a regular basis far outstripped any money that he needed to campaign. There was just something about him. Replacing him with another Democratic politician would be incredibly difficult because they wouldn't embody the same qualities that Obama had, and he derived his authority from his charisma. that X factor about him, just something that made him that wee bit different. In football terms, I often refer to Sir Alex Ferguson of Manchester United. There was just something about him, his leadership, his immense leadership skills, his ability to communicate. You know, you take Alex Ferguson out, you replace him with someone else, regardless of how good a manager they are, it's not quite the same. It's not quite the same. So the authority derives from that energy and that magnetism and that charisma that they have. People like Bonaparte in the past had it, you know. I suppose Donald Trump has it to an extent as well. You know, if you just picked a Republican out like Mike Pence, the vice president, and replaced Trump with him, I don't think Trump's followers would trust the same amount of authority within Pence as they would do Trump, because, you know, like him or loathe him, there's something about Trump that makes him that wee bit different. So that's charismatic authority. Switching to the final is legal rational. So regardless of tradition, regardless of the charisma that someone has, if you hold an office, you have authority by virtue of holding that office. So, for example, I could take a list of Conservative Party leaders. Now, Boris Johnson has got a lot of charisma, arguably more than Theresa May, but over time, each of them had an authority within their political parties because they were the leader of the party. They had the right to lead that party. And Max Weber thinks it's probably the most common one. Moving forward, it's going to be the most common one. If someone holds an office or holds a job, they have the right to have that authority. If you look at something like Mr. Stewart as head teacher of Biggar High School, you know, he's charismatic, of course he is, but he has his authority because of the office he holds. And if someone else was to step into that office, they would also carry that authority as well by virtue of being head teacher. So Max Weber thinks that perhaps legal rational authority is going to be the one that drives things forward. That's going to be the most common one. And perhaps traditional authority is going to become a bit outdated as the amount of monarchies decline, the amount of dynasties decline. And charismatic is probably the hardest one to actually depend upon, because, you know, you can have an Obama, but when's the next time you're going to have a Barack Obama? When's the next... You can't bottle that charisma and replicate it. It comes along every now and again. And, you know, if someone's got a particular type of charisma, you just can't repeat it. I mean, that's just the way things are. Moving finally on, folks, and we look at legitimacy. Legitimacy means the right to govern. And within your PowerPoints and your booklets, you will come across Andrew Haywood, and you will come across Beetham, and a few other theorists who kind of talk about this. Weber makes a link between legitimacy and authority as well. Legitimacy means rightful authority. Now, there is a big question on what is legitimate and what isn't. You can have kind of legal legitimacy, and you can have what is seen to be legitimate. So, for example, today in Catalonia, the region of Spain, which includes Barcelona, there is a very, very strong independence movement there who feel that the Spanish government's heavy-handedness during their recent attempted referendum, you know, when the Spanish government sent out the police and, you know, a lot of protesters were battered, basically. There was a feeling, and there is a feeling within Catalonia, that Spain has lost its legitimacy. The Spanish government has lost its legitimacy to govern Catalonia because of that. Now, legally, yes, they still have the legitimacy, but this is why legitimacy is such a kind of a curious thing, because legitimacy is something that can be seen to be the case rather than actually being the case. However, if I look back historically, one of the things I talk about with my higher history is when Republicans set up a parliament, an assembly in Dublin called the Dáil, back in the late 1910s, to be an independent parliament to govern Ireland of its own. The people of Ireland, many of the people of Ireland, seen the Dáil as the legitimate parliament, didn't see Westminster as the legitimate parliament, but the British government said, listen, it's the Dáil that's illegitimate because it's not legal. So that's a curious thing. Even Sinn Féin today do not take their seats in the Westminster Parliament because they do not see the Westminster Parliament as having a legitimate right to govern, a rightful right to govern in Northern Ireland. So therefore they do not take their seats. And that brings me to the idea of democratic legitimacy, folks. Back in 2016, when Donald Trump won the presidential election, in the lead up to that victory, he was asked, would you concede the election to Clinton and congratulate her if she wins the election? And he says, I'll wait and see. That was seen as quite concerning because it undermined democratic legitimacy. Within a democracy, legitimacy is gained by the fact that the loser respects the process so as to respect the rightful winner. Now, Hillary Clinton did respect Donald Trump's victory in the end. Had it been the other way about, we would have seen what happened. But democratic legitimacy rests on this idea that you respect the right of the vote, the decision of the voters, and the loser respects that. But legitimacy is quite a difficult one to get your head around, folks. Whether it's how you see things, if you see things as legitimate, or whether things are legally legitimate. There is an interaction that you've got to consider between that and authority. So, PAL, how you tackle this in an essay, folks? If it's a 20-mark essay, I would do one big paragraph in power, one big paragraph in authority, and one big paragraph in legitimacy. And I would try to go through the 3 points that Lux mentions, the 3 points that Weber mentions, and then for legitimacy, which you could make it slightly shorter, is bring in Haywood and bring in Beetham and a few others if you need to as well. So it's a really interesting topic, folks, and it's really topical. But you'll notice throughout this video, I've brought in a range of examples. Try not to bring in the Chinese-Indian example in an essay, but bring in relevant things. Talk about Obama, talk about Trump, talk about Bonaparte if you have to, talk about the Kims, talk about the popes, the monarchy, talk about the red bus, talk about what you have to do, illustrate with examples. Make sure that you show the relevance of each of these concepts as you go throughout. You'll notice that I have deliberately worn this t-shirt for you guys today, in solidarity, although Brexit in the current circumstances seems like a footnote in history. I wish you all well. I hope you're all taking care, and all the best.